presentation tonight, which is called Is God for Real? So thank you all for coming out on this cold night, and I'd also like to welcome those of you who are live streaming. Good evening or good morning if you're on the other side of the world, as some of you might be, and also for those of you who will tune in later to our YouTube. And this is my fabulous friend Bridget, who's going to be co-hosting with me tonight. We really hope that you all enjoy the program tonight. We've got a really amazing program for you. First of all, I'd like you to all take out your mobile phones and look at them and then turn them off, because I know sometimes we think we have turned them off and we haven't. So if you could turn them off or put them on silent if you'd like to do that, just so that everyone's really comfortable. The other thing is bathrooms. If you need it, you'll go straight out the front door and over to the right-hand side over here. And the men's bathrooms are on the right-hand side first, and then the women's bathrooms. We've got some lots of different resources that we'll be using throughout the program, and they'll be available for you later. And also you may have seen this, the wonderful flyer that you were probably given in order to come here tonight. So if you'd like to have more to take maybe back to some friends, we'll invite you to have a look at the table at the back of the church, and you can take those with you. So these particular meetings that we're having, the presentations, quite often the subject matter will raise questions, it might raise comments in your mind. So what we'll do is encourage you tonight just to hold on to those questions. And afterwards, Peter, our speaker, or one of us will be really happy to take the time to talk with you. So it's my pleasure tonight to invite our wonderful world-renowned speaker that we have tonight, which is Peter Watts. He's been talking on this subject on many occasions over about 20 years. And he actually hails from the UK, from the United Kingdom, but he's called Australia home for the past 20 years. So if you can all give Peter Watts a wonderful warm welcome tonight. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Naomi, and thank you for your warm welcome. I think world-renowned speaker might be a bit strong, but but anyway, thank you so much for coming. Oh, I tell you what I need to do. I need to pop down here and pick up my clicker. Otherwise, it's easier to shift the slides along with this. Thanks for coming tonight. The series is called Is God for Real? Tonight, we're going to begin at the beginning. We're going to ask the question, does God exist? And we want to ask that question in relation to another question, which is, does it really matter? Does it matter whether God exists or not? What is the difference between a universe in which God exists and a universe in which he doesn't exist? What are the implications of that? And so, does God exist and does it matter? Another question we could ask is, what kind of God, if God does exist, what kind of God exists? And we're going to explore that a little bit in this program. Back in the 1960s, Time magazine put on its front cover this headline, Is God Dead? And the idea of that article in that Time magazine was not so much that God had been alive and he'd suddenly died, but rather is the idea of God dead in Western culture. And they were asking that question back in the 1960s. In fact, this was published the year that I was born. So does God exist and does it matter? We're going to explore some terms. So we have atheist, agnostic, and theist. An atheist is someone who does not believe in God. So, you know, we've come through 2 years of COVID. Somebody might be asymptomatic. That means they have no symptoms. And then atheist is no God, right? So that's what that means, an atheist. An agnostic, on the other hand, it's without knowledge. An agnostic is somebody without knowledge. So they don't know if God exists or not. They're not saying he doesn't. They're not saying he does. They just don't know. They don't have enough information. They're an agnostic. And the third one, of course, is a theist, somebody who does believe in God. And I've laid claim to all three of those titles in my lifetime. I was an atheist up until my mid-20s living in the UK. And I guess there was a time when I had questions. I wasn't sure. And then certainly today I am a theist, and we'll share a little bit about that as we go along. What we're going to try to do tonight is I'm not going to try to prove to you that God exists. And, some people try to do that. They try to prove God exists, or somebody might say, I can prove that God doesn't exist. And we'll have a look at that. But what we want to see is, where does the evidence tend? In other words, where does the evidence lead us? And we want to look at some lines of evidence in regards to the question of the existence of God. So first and foremost, where did I come from? I'm sure that you maybe as a child have asked that question. Maybe you're still asking that question. This is something that seems to be a part of the human nature, that we want to know where we come from. And maybe if you've had children, your children have asked you this question, where did I come from? I remember a story about an American family, and a third grader, 9 years old, came home. He had an assignment from school he was supposed to write about, and he went into the kitchen, talked to Mum, and said, Mum, where did I come from? And she was busy, and she said, well, the stork brought you. That's what they say in America. Anyway, he said, thanks, Mum, and he wandered off into the lounge room where Grandma was knitting, and he said to Grandma, where did Mum come from? And Grandma said, well, the stork brought her. And, well, Grandma, where did you come from? Well, the stork brought me too. And he went to his room and he started to write, and he said, there hasn't been a normal birth in our family for 3 generations. So you can't fool the kids. But I mentioned before, and Naomi mentioned as well, that I come from the UK, and if I told you that I had parents in the UK, in fact, my father passed away about 15 years ago, but my mum's still in the UK. In fact, I spoke to her about 3 hours ago on Skype. But for me to have parents in the UK, that's not going to be startling to you. You're not going to have any reason to disbelieve that, right? The very fact that I'm standing here presupposes that I had parents. Okay. But those parents also had parents, and they had parents, and they had parents. How far back? Back to where? Where did we as human beings come from? And one of the lines of evidence we're going to examine is the line of evidence from origins. Where did life actually come from? We now understand that life comes from life. Maybe you remember in the history books that they used to believe in spontaneous generation. They used to believe, there's some garbage and rubbish in the corner and suddenly it produces flies and mice. That was called spontaneous generation, and of course that was debunked. We now know that the rubbish attracts flies and mice. It doesn't produce the flies and mice. We understood that life comes from life. Life doesn't come from dead things. And so life comes from life, but something else we've learned is that like comes from like. This question, which came first, the chicken or the egg? Science is unable to answer that question. You realise that, don't you? Because, of course, every chicken came out of an egg, and every egg, eggs lay chicken. Eggs lay chicken? No, it's the other way around. That's what you're here for, to correct me when I get it wrong. Chickens lay eggs, right? And so which came first, the chicken or the egg? Well, unless you were an eyewitness, that's a hard question to answer. But just as life begets life, we know that like begets like. That is to say that cats produce cats, and dogs produce dogs, and chickens produce chickens. And if that's true, where did we get all the diversification? And so we want to have an explore of this question of origins. Where did life come from? Where did we come from? Our planet Earth, has been described as dwelling in the Goldilocks zone. Anybody ever heard that term before? That phrase? Some of you. So that means to say that the Earth is just in the right place in our solar system. It's not too close to the sun, like Venus, where it's too hot for life. And it's not too far away from the sun, like Mars. It's too cold for life. But it's in the just right. The Goldilocks and the 3 bears? One was too hot, one was too cold, and one was just right. And planet Earth happens to inhabit that part of the solar system that's just right for supporting life. Now, is that coincidence or is that by design? Not only is it in the right area from a temperature point of view, it's got an abundance of liquid water. And we haven't found liquid water in other places in the solar system. And so we have an abundance of liquid water. Of course, we have a oxygen, nitrogen atmosphere as well, which is ideal for supporting life. And the question is that by accident or by design? The Earth is actually tilted on its axis 23 degrees, which gives us our seasons. And it rotates once every 24 hours, which gives us a nice even warming and cooling so that we're not boiling and we're not freezing, although you might think you are at some times in the year. Is that by accident or by design? Let's consider this. If the Earth evolved in its place in the solar system just by chance, and it has all of the elements needed to produce and to sustain life, what about the moon? Man has been to the moon 6 times, unless you believe the conspiracy theories that we haven't been. But man has been, there were 6 Apollo missions to the moon. We've brought back rocks and dust. And whether you, whatever you may believe, they believe that the Earth and the moon are approximately the same age, made of approximately the same stuff. And yet there's no life on the moon. The moon doesn't have an atmosphere. There's no water on the moon. If the Earth arose just by chance in this area of the universe, the moon is in the same Goldilocks zone, but has none of those things. Now, is that by accident or by design, or is it that it was designed for a different purpose? You see, I believe we can recognize design when we see it. Over here on the left-hand side, you have just a normal rocky mountain range. On the right-hand side, you have a place called Mount Rushmore, and that's in South Dakota. I have a friend who lives in Minnesota, and one day I went out there and we took a road trip from Minnesota to South Dakota to see Mount Rushmore. And you can see the size of the pine trees in the foreground there. So you can see the size of these huge faces that have been carved into the rock. What is it? Washington, Jefferson, Roosevelt, and Lincoln. And so, do you know that 95% of the carving was done by dynamite? They would drill a hole, put the right amount of dynamite in, and blow a piece of rock off. And can you imagine blowing the guy's nose off or something? You know, you'd have to get that right. I mean, that's pretty intelligent to be able to design that. Now, here's the question. If I was to say to you, look at those 2 mountain ranges, the one on the right, it's just the wind and the rain over thousands of years have carved those faces, and isn't that amazing? You would never buy that, because the design is too intricate, it's too complex. You recognize that. And so you wouldn't buy that. But here's the deal. How is it that we can recognize design in a stone face that's just been carved, but we don't recognize design in a human face that can breathe and eat and speak and think and hear and see? You see what I'm saying? Why would we say that's designed, but the human face is not, when it is so much more complex? This design idea is called in the scientific community the anthropic principle. In other words, the world and the solar system, the universe around us, seems to be fine-tuned to support life. And it's called the anthropic principle because anthropos means mankind. And so it's the idea that it looks designed for humanity to survive. But some say, well, it just looks that way. Or is it actually that way? The universe seems to be designed with man in mind. Modern cosmology has identified dozens of measurable characteristics of the universe. Each of these characteristics are fine-tuned to such a degree that moving even one of them in either direction, only a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a percentage, would make the existence of life anywhere in the universe impossible. We would live then not in a life-sustaining universe, but in a life-prohibitive universe. Our universe seems to be very fine-tuned, and here's a list of some of those physical constants that they've discovered: a strong nuclear force constant, a weak nuclear force constant, a gravitational force constant, electromagnetic force constant, and on and on and on. There are many more. And again, you move them a fraction, and there's no life, not just human life, no life can exist. Somebody has explained it this way. Imagine that you're stood up against a brick wall, and a blindfold is put upon you. But before the blindfold is put upon you, you see 40 riflemen lining up in front of you. They put the blindfold on. One guy says, ready, aim, fire. And you hear all the guns go off. And you flinch. And a couple of seconds later, you realize that you haven't been hit. And you think, that's got to be lucky. And you wonder, because you've got the blindfold on, you're thinking, so what happened? Are they all really bad shots? Did they miss on purpose? Did they shoot each other? What happened? So you lift the blindfold and you notice that there's a spray of bullets all around you in a pattern. You would have to conclude that they missed on purpose. And this is how somebody has described the anthropic principle. All those physical force constants are so fine-tuned to allow for life that they've all the bullets have missed us, and life actually takes place. Sir Frederick Hoyle was an astronomer, a British astronomer. He said this: a common sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with physics as well as the chemistry and biology, and that there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature. The numbers one calculates from the facts seem to me so overwhelming as to put this conclusion beyond question. He's saying somebody has tampered or got involved. You ever seen the science show Catalyst on ABC? There was an episode dedicated to the anthropic principle where they asked the question, why do we live in such a finely tuned universe? They asked one scientist, and his answer simply was, well, we just do. That's just the way it is. We just do. That was his answer. They asked another scientist. He says, well, actually, there is a theory called the multiverse theory. Have you heard of this? The multiverse theory, where there are multiple, in fact, an infinite number of universes, and we just happen to be in a universe that supports life. There might be many others that don't, but because there's an infinite number of them, it's not a problem to, by chance, come up with a universe that supports life. The problem with the multiverse theory is that we don't have any actual evidence of the multiverse theory, but is a theory that is created to try to solve the problem of why the universe looks so fine-tuned. They asked another scientist. He said on the show, we are really only a virtual reality program. I heard Elon Musk talking about this too. He said that, video games are becoming very much more so realistic that it's almost impossible to determine between reality and virtual reality. You ever seen one of those deep fake videos where they make somebody famous make a statement that they didn't really make, and it looks very, very convincing? They're getting better and better at it, which is really dangerous. But anyway, the idea is that you're not here. I'm not here. You're just you're programmed. You're in a program running on a computer, and you think you're here. You think you feel all the things you feel, but you're really only a virtual reality program. That's what one scientist proposed. I think our experiences tell us that that's probably not the case. And one other scientist got creative. He said, our descendants in the distant future travelled back in time, tinkered with the laws of physics at the Big Bang. Now, I used to watch Doctor Who, and that's called a time paradox, because you have to get to the end to go back to the beginning, right? You have to get to the end to get the time machine to go back to the beginning and start it all off. Anyway, what was interesting to me is when they asked this question on Catalyst, this ABC science show, why do we live in such a finely tuned universe? Nobody suggested we live in a finely tuned universe because it was finely tuned by somebody. In other words, why can't we at least explore the possibility that that's the reasonable explanation? Why aren't we allowed to go there? Back in 2009, this is a British newspaper, the Daily Mail. They had the headline, "Why We Are Born to Believe in God." It's wired into the brain, say psychologists. Humans are programmed to believe in God because it gives them a better chance of survival, researchers claim. The findings of Bruce Hood, Professor of Developmental Psychology at Bristol University suggests that magical or supernatural beliefs are hardwired into the brains from birth, is what they're finding. Freeman Dyson was an award-winning theoretical physicist and mathematician, and this is what he said towards the end of his life. He said, "The more I examine the universe and the details of its architecture, the more evidence I find that the universe in some sense must have known we were coming." That's interesting. And he's remarking on this fine-tunedness of the universe. This actually reminds me of a passage in the Old Testament scriptures, the old Hebrew scriptures, from the book of Isaiah 45, verse 18. It says, "For thus says the Lord that created the heavens, God himself that formed the earth and made it. He established it. He created it not in vain. He formed it to be inhabited. I am the Lord and there is none else." In other words, that passage is telling us that the earth was made, and it was made in order to support life. And that's really what Dyson is saying in a way. There was a famous atheist, Anthony Flew. He spent a lot of time writing about why he was an atheist. And yet, towards the end of his life, he changed his mind and he wrote a book. There is no God. No, he scribbled that out and said, "There is a God." How the world's most notorious atheist changed his mind. And in his book he says, "What I think the DNA material has done," and what he's talking about is the complexity that has been discovered within DNA. He says, "What I think the DNA material has done is that it has shown by the almost unbelievable complexity of the arrangements which are needed to produce life, that intelligence must have been involved in getting these extraordinarily diverse elements to work together." He goes on, he says, "The only satisfactory explanation of such end-directed self-replicating life as we see on Earth is an infinitely intelligent mind." And he says, "I had to go where the evidence leads." And that's really what I'm asking us to explore, really, is to explore the evidence. Certainly that's where the evidence led for me also. Bill Gates commented on DNA. By the way, tomorrow, don't miss tomorrow's program. Tomorrow, we're looking at the subject of evolution. Did we really evolve? That's tomorrow's program. And we're going to unpack that a little bit more. We'll touch on it in this meeting tonight, but tomorrow we're going to unpack that a lot more. So, did we really evolve? And then tomorrow, the second program is why so much suffering. We'll talk about that. Bill Gates wrote in his book, The Road Ahead, back in 1995, he says, "DNA is like a computer program, but far, far more advanced than any software ever created." I guess he would know. That's what his opinion was on that. Again, from the ancient Hebrew scriptures, about 3,000 years ago, this was written, "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the skies show his handiwork. Day to day pours out speech, and night to night reveals knowledge." In other words, the more we examine the natural world here on earth, the more we examine the heavens, the more knowledge we will receive about its nature. You know, they've put a new new telescope up there called the James Webb Telescope. You seen that one? They've surpassed the Hubble. They've put it further out in orbit, and it's going to start sending pictures back pretty soon, I think. I think it was due to send some pictures back in July, so I'm looking out for that, see what it discovers. Charles Darwin, of course, popularised the theory of evolution, the origin of species by means of natural selection. And I want you to know what he says here in one of his letters. He said, "The horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of a man's mind, which has been developed from the minds of lower animals, are of any value or are at all trustworthy. Would anyone trust the convictions of a monkey's mind if there are any convictions in such a mind?" I mean, he makes a good point, doesn't he? Would you trust a monkey on how to live your life? You know? And he's saying, if we really are nothing more than overdeveloped monkeys, why should we trust any of the conclusions that we come to in the library or the laboratory or anywhere else? And I think he has a good point. You know, Darwin was very cautious about his own work because he had a lot of doubts. And we'll read more about that tomorrow as well. Professor Paul Davis, he writes, science is based on the assumption that the universe is thoroughly rational and logical at every level. Atheists claim that the laws of nature exist reasonlessly and that the universe is ultimately absurd. As a scientist, I find this hard to accept. There must be an unchanging rational ground in which the logical, orderly nature of the universe is rooted. In other words, if we're exploring the universe around us, we should find it should be chaotic, basically, is what he's saying, if it arose by chance. Francis Crick, he was co-discoverer of the structure of DNA. Notice what he says here. An honest man, armed with all the knowledge available to us now, could only state that in some sense, the origin of life appears at the moment to be almost a miracle. Interesting. Well, that was in 1981. I wonder if he would say it would be a miracle by now. Well, we shall see. I mentioned before that I grew up in the UK and I was an atheist till my mid-20s. And these are three of the more prominent voices, I guess, of atheism in the last 30 years. You may recognise some of them. Christopher Hitchens, who sadly now passed away. But Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris, an American. These have been some of the more prominent voices of atheism in the last 30 years. And what's interesting, these are called the new atheists. But what's interesting is their arguments that they use are really no different than the arguments being used 50 years earlier. But what is new is that they think that atheism is far less costly to society. So atheists of the past recognize that many of the values that we seem to feel are important as human beings, they don't get supported by atheism because those values come from someplace. And atheists of the past recognized it would change culture and maybe not for the better. Whereas the new atheists believe that atheism actually would not only not deteriorate our culture, but actually make it better. They believe we're better off without religion. They also, another difference between the new atheists and the atheists of the past is that they're less tolerant of religion. So an atheist of the past might say, well, you believe that there is a God, I don't believe, but we can still have a chat. And I think the new atheists are less tolerant of religion. They see many evils in religion, and certainly many evils have been perpetrated in the name of religion. There's no doubt in that. But the third thing I think that is different with the new atheists is that they seem to reserve their most vehement criticisms of religion for the Christian faith. And I wonder if that is because the Christian faith is the one that has a more rational basis than many of the religions of the world. We can talk about that as we go on. Existentialist Albert Camus admitted that the death of God meant the loss of purpose, joy, and everything that makes life worth living. Why? Why would that be the case? Well, here's a quote from John Hort. He wrote a book called God and the New Atheism. He said, the new softcore atheists assume that by dint of Darwinism, we can just drop God like Santa Claus without having to witness the complete collapse of Western culture, including our sense of what is rational and moral. Who gets to decide what's right and wrong? They don't have that debate amongst the lions and the tigers, right? Who gets to decide what's right and wrong? At least the hardcore atheists understood that if we're truly sincere in our atheism, the whole web of meanings and values that had clustered around the idea of God in Western culture has to go down the drain along with its organising centre. In other words, if you and I are simply a bag of chemicals, if somebody comes up to you and punches you in the face, well, that's just one bag of chemicals impacting another bag of chemicals, right? Is that right or is that wrong? Well, there's no such thing, right? What about, as human beings, we tend to put a lot of importance on the emotion of love. We want to be loved by our parents. We want to be loved by somebody else. We want to give love to someone else. Love seems to be important to us. But if you believe that you're just a bag of chemicals or just a highly developed animal, then love is no more important than indigestion. It's just a chemical reaction, right? Your heart races a little bit faster, It doesn't mean anything. Just like indigestion doesn't mean anything if you take away the purpose and the reason for human beings existing, if we're just animals. Time magazine asked the question in 1991, evil, does it exist or do bad things just happen? You know what's interesting about that? Evil, does it exist or do bad things just happen? How do you define a bad thing if evil doesn't exist? There is no bad, there is no good, there is no right, there is no wrong. These are just human constructs. But I don't think we buy that as humans. I think that we recognize there is right and wrong. And I think this is part of the human condition. Back in ABC in 2013, there was a news story where it was about a British couple. A British couple had been handed lengthy jail terms after being convicted of manslaughter for starting a house fire which killed 6 of their children. Judge Catherine Thirlwall said Mick Philpott was a disturbingly dangerous man. You have no moral compass, she told him. Question is, where will we get a moral compass, and should we have one? If you've got too many cats around, you just destroy the cats. You've got cockroaches, get rid of the cockroaches. You've got too many kids, just get rid of the kids. But apparently somebody's going to jail, right? Because we believe that's wrong to take human life. In his book, River Out of Eden, Richard Dawkins said this. He said, in the universe of blind physical forces and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt and other people are going to get lucky. And you won't find any rhyme or reason to it, nor any justice. Now, by the way, this is one of the reasons why many people question whether there can be a God, especially a God who cares, because there's so much strife and suffering in the world. How can that possibly be? If God cares, why doesn't he do something? And maybe he cares, but he can't do something. Well, he can't be very powerful then. And this is the notion. We're going to talk about that tomorrow, so don't miss tomorrow's program. Dawkins goes on, he said, the universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil and no good. Nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. DNA neither knows nor cares. DNA just is, and we dance to its music. The problem with that is if you run that to its end result, if somebody is dragged before the courts and they have sexually assaulted, maybe they have raped somebody you know, maybe it's a daughter of yours, or it's a sister of yours, or it's your wife, or it's your mother. And he's dragged before the judge. And his defense is, I was just dancing to my DNA. Is that acceptable defense? There was a couple of doctors in America, I remember reading this in Time magazine. They'd published a book, 2 medical professionals, 2 doctors in the States, who believed that we all arose from apes and we're just highly developed monkeys. And they wrote in their book, you can't really blame a rapist because he's just going back to his animal instincts. And thankfully, Time magazine slammed the book. They just slammed these guys and said, what are you thinking? But how many of us would accept that as a reasonable explanation? Just dancing to my DNA. Just acting on my animal instincts. You can't blame me. Dawkins had a campaign in London, and he had these signs on London buses which said, there's probably no God, now stop worrying, enjoy your life. I think it's very interesting that he put probably in there, right? There's probably no God. But here's the thing, if there really were no God, would you not worry? Would you just enjoy life more if there were no God? David Belinsky, PhD, wrote a book called The Devil's Delusions, Atheism and its Scientific Pretensions. Notice what he says here. He says, what Hitler did not believe and what Stalin did not believe and what Mao did not believe and what the SS did not believe and what the Gestapo did not believe was that God was watching what they were doing. They didn't believe that. But if there's a God, then maybe there's justice and maybe there's accountability. And we'll talk more about that later in the series. I said before, it seems to be very important to us as human beings to wonder, are we alone in the universe? Who are we? Where did we come from? Time magazine had this question, is anybody out there? That was back in 1996. Are we alone in the universe? We get to 2019 and National Geographic believes we've solved the question. We are not alone. I find it that these covers are very interesting. It says, we are not alone, and then it says, scientists say there must be other life in the universe. Here's how they're searching for it. So you start out with, we're not alone, then there must be life, and we're still searching. So it's a little bit of a contradiction. But back in the UK in 2013, they started, have you ever heard of SETI, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence? It's an American program where they point their radio telescopes out to the sky and they're listening for coded information because they believe if they hear coded information, they'll believe that's an evidence of intelligence. Back in 2013, BBC News reported that the UK astronomers are to coordinate their search for alien signals. British scientists are to make a concerted effort to look for alien life among the stars. The scientists believe it is time UK effort was properly coordinated. Quote, there are billions of planets out there. It would be remiss of us not to at least have half an ear open to any signals that might be being sent to us. What if somebody had been sending messages to us for a long, long time, but we didn't like the messages? So let's build a radio telescope. Do you know what I'm saying? This guy is right, by the way. It would be remiss of us not to have half an ear open to any signals that might be being sent to us. And maybe somebody has been trying to communicate. George Harrison, one of the Beatles who passed away some years ago, he said, for every human there is a quest to find the answer to why I am here. Who am I? Where did I come from? Where am I going? For me, that became the most important thing in my life. Everything else is secondary. And I kind of agree with George. I got to that place where I wanted to know. Now, this man's name is Alistair McGrath, and he's a professor at Oxford. Richard Dawkins is also a professor at Oxford. Richard Dawkins wrote a book called The God Delusion. Alistair McGrath wrote a book called The Dawkins Delusion. Can you imagine staff meetings? Alistair McGrath, he wrote this book, and he says, although I was passionately and totally persuaded of the truth of atheism as a young man, I subsequently found myself persuaded that Christianity was a much more interesting and intellectually exciting worldview than atheism. And that's basically, I concur with that statement. I was an atheist, and I was completely convinced of atheism. My brother's still an atheist, but I concur with Alistair McGrath's statement. I told you before, we seem to be very interested in programs like, who do you think you are? We want to know our background. Well, what about our distant background? Who are we as human beings? Are we animals, or are we more than animals? We're going to really look at that, particularly tomorrow morning, so I hope you come back tomorrow morning. Grab yourself a brochure, invite a friend, and come back tomorrow, and we'll explore that a little bit more. We're going to wrap up our first session in a moment, but I'll finish with this illustration maybe. How much do we really know? As human beings, when I was an atheist, I guess atheism is a fairly, what would you say? To be an atheist, you've basically got to say that in the universe, which is vast, You're basically saying there is no God anywhere in that universe. And giving that I'm one individual on a planet of 7.5 billion individuals, and our little planet is just a speck of dust in our solar system, which is a speck of dust in our galaxy, which is a speck of dust in the universe, to be able to stand up and say there is no God anywhere, you'd have to know something. You'd almost have to be God to be able to make that declaration. So how much do we really know? Well, probably less than we think. I had a friend who was running some meetings, and he was invited to go behind the Iron Curtain when Romania, it was Hungary, when Hungary moved out of communism. He was invited to go there, went to Budapest, went to a university there, major university, and he was invited to speak for an hour on why he believed God existed. And they would have a professor from the university who was an atheist, and he would speak for an hour on why God did not exist. And so he went there, and they said to him at the beginning of the program, "I'm terribly sorry, but the gentleman who is going to speak for an hour on why God does not exist has not been able to make it. Would you be willing to speak for 2 hours?" He said, "Sure." And so he begins his presentation to a large group of students. And he's talking for about 10 minutes, and then a student stands up and says, "Excuse me, wait a minute, you're talking as though God exists. We don't believe that God exists." And he stood there and he thought, what am I going to say next? And he said, "Well, can I ask you what you're studying?" And I don't know what the man was studying. Let's say he was studying physics. And he said, "Of all the books printed on the subject of physics this year, how many of you personally read?" He said, "Well, hardly any of them." He said, "Well, what about all the books on the subject of physics that have ever been written? How many of those have you read?" "Well, hardly any." "What about all the books that have ever been written on the subject of chemistry, or all the books that have ever been written on the subject of biology? What about all of the books that have been written about the dynasties of China? What about all the books that have been written about the languages of India? What about all the books that have been written about the religion of Egypt? How many of those books?" "Well, hardly any." He says, "Of all the knowledge of the history of the world, would it be fair to say that you know less than 5%? He said, "Yes." Now, we all know less than 1%, right? He said, "Is it possible that God exists in the 95% of knowledge that you admit you have no knowledge of?" And he had to admit that it was possible. He said, "Then you're not an atheist." Because an atheist said it's not possible for there to be a God. There is no God. But the reality is we just don't know that much. Right? We have to be humble. We just don't know that much. I was sharing this message actually at a community centre in New South Wales. And outside the community centre was a skate park. And on the skate park, somebody had graffitied, "I want to believe." I don't know who put that there. I don't know what they put it there in relation to. But I think that there are a lot of people who want to believe that somebody's out there. They want to believe that somebody cares about little old planet Earth. But they just want some evidence to base that on. And what I promise you we will do is we're going to walk through this program step by step, and we're going to look at evidence. Okay? And we will get to make that choice. But I want to believe. You know, I do believe. I used to be an atheist, but I do now believe that there is a God, a master designer, an intelligent designer who created our world, who created the universe, who created life, who created human beings. And that's what we want to talk a little bit about. We're going to take a break, just 10 minutes. And then we want to come back. In our next program, we want to ask, is there anything we can trust? Okay, maybe God exists. Maybe God exists. But which one? And maybe he's, of the myriad of gods that have been suggested by humanity, which one of those? Or maybe he's none of those. How will we know? And how do we know what we can trust. We'll come back in 10 minutes. Grab yourself a drink, have a walk around, and we'll come back in 10 minutes with, is there anything we can trust? Thank you for listening. And, tomorrow is important because those two topics probably are the two biggest objections that people have to a belief in God. And we'll talk a little bit more about them at the end. So, but let's get into tonight's second session. Is there anything we can trust? We learned a long time ago that you can't believe what you read in the newspapers. And of course, one newspaper got shut down because of the scandal and the libel and the lies that it was publishing about people's lives. And there was a court case, and it eventually got shut down, the News of the World in the UK. And so we've learned that. But, the Oxford English Dictionary every year publishes a word of the year. Did you know that? And the word of the year for 2016, any ideas what it might be? Post-truth. That was their word of the year for 2016, post-truth. And likewise, the Collins English Dictionary, their word of the year for 2017 was fake news. That was their word of the year. The idea is that some are suggesting we've moved into a post-truth environment where we just gather around what we want to believe and that's it. There is no such thing as objective truth. I'm just going to believe this, and you might believe something else, and people talk about that's your truth. But we want to explore whether there is actually an objective truth, a truth that applies to all of us. And we've moved a little bit away from that, I suppose, in the last several years, according to Collins and the Oxford Dictionary. Where do we go for truth? Where do we go for information? Where do we go for trustworthy counsel? Is it social media? Certainly those platforms are very popular. I have a Facebook page. Don't have a Twitter account. But I have a Facebook page. And, is that where we are going to find truth? Has any of you seen The Social Dilemma, the movie? If you don't want to watch the movie on Netflix, that's fine. Just go to YouTube and you can see the 2-minute trailer for free. But the 2-minute trailer has everything you need to know. The Social Dilemma, I think it was 2020, it was released. And it's a documentary, and it's about the people who created the social platforms that we use. Back 15 odd years ago, they were in their early to mid-20s, and they created Twitter, and they created Facebook, and there was a guy on there, on this film, on this movie documentary. He was responsible for creating the like button on Facebook. And what you have them now is 15 years later, and they're a little bit older, and maybe they've got young kids, and they're telling you in this documentary, we created these things to be addictive, and, one of the things they put on there, and you can see it in the trailer, and I recommend you watch the trailer at least, is that if you punch in climate change, depending on where you live in the world and who you are and what your history, you get a different set of results. Because everything we put in there is monitored and collected and used in order to help you buy stuff, essentially. And so is that a good place to go for reliable material? But I recommend you watch the trailer. Even some people that we put trust in. I used to use Lance Armstrong as a great, paragon of virtue. He came back from cancer and got to be 7 times, Tour de France winner. And of course, then it was found, and he admitted that he had been using drugs throughout the whole process, performance-enhancing drugs, and he was stripped of the 7 titles. And it's not just Lance Armstrong. There's many people, aren't there, who, you might have grown up with and said, oh, this was a really nice guy, that was a really nice person. Then you find out things about them that pulls the rug out from under you, and it's not quite the same. All right, Bit of a pop quiz. Who are these people? Who's the man on the left, top left? Mark McGowan. He is the Premier of your state. Okay, and the guy on the right-hand side? Boris Johnson. Well, he still is the Prime Minister, but he's hanging in there until somebody can come and take the reins. He's just resigned, or he's going to resign. They're preparing a successor. So Boris Johnson. Then, of course, if you don't know this person, I don't know where you've been for half a century. That's Queen Elizabeth. She's the one on the coins and the banknotes. Well, one of the banknotes. Joe Biden, President of the United States. And do you know who that one is? Anybody know the bottom right? Governor General, well done. Do you know what his name is? David Hurley. That's his name. Point being, all of these people have something in common. Yes, they're all leaders. Yes, they're all involved in politics in some degree, but they have something else in common. They were all sworn into office by placing their hand on a book. And of course, that book was the Bible. Now, why is that, by the way? By the way, you know, Anthony Albanese, our current Prime Minister, he decided to be sworn in without the Bible. That's his prerogative. Only 2 Prime Ministers in Australia's history have been sworn in without the Bible. Anthony Albanese. Can you guess the other one? No, he was sworn in on the Bible. Julia Gillard. That's right. Because Julia Gillard said that she didn't believe in God. And so I respect the fact that she chose to act on her convictions. It's really easy to pick up a Bible and say, I believe, and not practice anything in the book. Right? Which is what many politicians have done in the past, which is why people don't trust politicians. But anyway, why the Bible, by the way? Well, because historically, some people say, well, they just do it for tradition. Maybe that's true. But historically, in the Western world, the Bible has been regarded as the book of greatest authority because it's not regarded as an ordinary book. You know, why not place your hand on the phone book? That might better represent your constituents, right? Why not place it on the dictionary? The dictionary is a big book. Why the Bible? Well, because it's regarded as not only a book, but the Word of God. It's regarded as a divinely inspired book. Now, let me pause here. Well, let's continue. We'll get to that bit in a minute. The Bible is the first book printed on a printing press, 1450. Johannes Gutenberg printed the first Bible on a printing press. Before that, they were handwritten. By the way, how many people do you think would have Bibles if you had to write one out to have one? That would take a while. This is a copy of the Gutenberg Bible. It's in the Manchester Library in the UK. It's valued, well, actually it's insured, or it was insured when I went to see it about 5 years ago. It was insured for £66 million. But I don't need to find 66 million because I have one here. But I also have one on my phone. You can get thousands of Bibles on your phone, right, for free. So you don't have to pay the 66 million, but of course it's a rare book now. And you know, at the end of each year, maybe you've seen this, sometimes they have a summary of the news, that they'll sort of review the news in December, and they'll look back and say, what were the big events of the last 12 months? And at the end of the decade, they look back over the last decade. And the end of a century, they look back over the last century. Well, at the end of the millennium, in year 2000, they were looking back over the last 1,000 years. And they said, what was the most important event of the last 1,000 years? And they said it was the printing of the Gutenberg Bible. For 2 reasons. Number one, the invention of printing led to an explosion in knowledge. But also, I think the fact that it was the Bible, the printing of the Bible, there was a major reform movement that occurred because of the printing of the Bible that changed the world. And we'll talk about more of that as history goes by. You know, many people, including myself, quote the Bible all the time without realizing it, because it's part of our common language. If you live in an English-speaking country, you will hear phrases like, money is the root of all evil, weak as water, go the extra mile, doubting Thomas, two-edged sword, turn the other cheek, a man after my own heart, a drop in the bucket, the powers that be, in the twinkling of an eye, a stone's throw, do unto others, nothing new under the sun, the writings on the wall. People use these phrases and many others, and they come from the Bible, but we don't realize we're quoting the Bible. But it's become so much a part of our English-speaking culture that it's crept into the language. If you listen to news radio or you read, news websites such as ABC or BBC, you'll see biblical phrases in there all the time. Even watching Channel 7 News or something. Now, why is this so? Why is the Bible regarded so important? Notice this. This is from the New Testament, and this is what it writes about itself. The claims of the Bible. The claim of the Bible is that the Bible is inspired. It's not just an ordinary book. It's inspired by God, and then men wrote it down. That's its claim. It says here, all Scripture is given by inspiration of God and is profitable for doctrine, for reproof, for correction, for instruction in righteousness, that the man of God may be complete, thoroughly equipped for every good work. So it's saying that it's inspired. Here's another one. This is the claim. We want to test that claim. 2 Peter 1:19-21. It says, knowing this first, that no prophecy of Scripture is of any private interpretation, for prophecy never came by the will of man, but the holy men of God spoke as they were moved by the Holy Spirit. So the people who wrote the Bible claimed that this is not, hey, I've got a great idea, I wrote it down, I hope you enjoy it. No, they said, I got this message from God, and I'm writing it down so that people can read it. And by the way, many of those people lost their lives for doing it, so they didn't seek to gain much. You know, the Bible is the bestseller every year. It's the best-selling book in history. There's some 5 billion copies in circulation in the world. It's also the best-selling book every year, but it comes out in so many different languages and so many different versions that it doesn't make the New York Times bestseller list. But it's a bestseller. But none of the people who wrote it got that money, right? In fact, they were threatened with death. And many of them did die for writing what they wrote. So, the Bible claims to be divinely inspired. How would we know whether it was or not? Let's take a look at some evidence. Internal consistency. We're going to look at a line of evidence called internal consistency. What does that mean? The Bible is not actually one book. It's really a library of 66 different books written by about 40 different authors. I've got 35 plus here, I think. 35 plus authors from many different backgrounds. So you have fishermen, and you have lawyers, and you have kings, and you have shepherds writing different parts of this book. 35 different authors from many different backgrounds. It's written over a period of 1,500 years. Written on 3 different continents, in 3 different languages. And yet, there is one unified message about the identity of God, about creation, about mankind, about salvation, about justice, heaven, death, and a whole host of other subjects. Now, if we could get 40 people in the room today and just say, I want you to write a piece on chocolate cake. You're not going to get 40 people in the same room to agree, right? And yet these people are separated by different cultures, they're separated by hundreds of miles, they're separated by hundreds of years, and they're writing consistently. That could only happen if you have somebody manipulating from above, and that's influencing the guy who wrote first, and influencing the guy who wrote last, and influencing all the people in the middle, because there are things in Revelation that reference things in Genesis. Think about the Bible's broad appeal. The Bible is read by young people and old people. How many young people read a 2,000-year-old book? It has been read by people from different eras. All throughout history, ever since the Bible was written, people have read the Bible. And it's read by people from vastly different cultures. You can go to a penthouse in Manhattan in New York and find somebody reading the Bible. And you can go to a thatched hut in Africa and find somebody reading the Bible. What's with that? The Bible's broad appeal, it would seem, because that is literally the case, it would seem that the book appeals to humanity. From wherever you live, however old you are, the book seems to be written for humanity. And that's why it's still read all these years later. Let's take a look at some archaeological evidence, because one of the things about the Bible, and I knew nothing about the Bible, I just thought it was a bunch of fairy stories. Like I said, I was an atheist. But, the Bible could have been a book of just proverbs. Good, sayings, wise sayings. But it's not. It contains loads of history about real people in real places who lived at a real time in history. And you can go visit those places. I've visited many of the places in the Middle East where the stories of the Bible take place. So let's take a look at some of the archaeological evidence. In Egypt, you can go to Egypt. This is from Karnak. This is one of the temples there at Karnak, and you've got all of these hieroglyphs etched into the walls. They just wrote stories all over their walls. But for hundreds and hundreds of years, nobody could read them. And eventually, in 1799, they found the Rosetta Stone in northern Egypt. And it was eventually deciphered in 1822 by a brilliant man, Jean-Francois Champollion. And this was a stone that contained a message in 3 different scripts. One of them was hieroglyphs, one of them was ancient Greek, and they were able to use the ancient Greek to decipher the hieroglyphs and be able to open up a whole new world of study, because all these walls began to speak. And what they discovered, that in messages that the Egyptians had left behind, they mentioned battles that they had with the Hittites. And the Hittites, it was believed, were just a mythical people. They're mentioned in the Bible about 35 to 40 times, but they didn't really exist. We haven't got any evidence of them. And scholars 200 years ago, scholars thought the Hittites were a myth made up by the Bible writers. But then they read the hieroglyphs, and the hieroglyphs talked about the Hittites and the battles that the Egyptians had with the Hittites. And today, Hattusa, the capital of the Hittite Empire in Turkey, is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. We could talk about Ur of the Chaldees. Ur of the Chaldees, what's that? Well, that was the birthplace, according to the Bible, that was the birthplace of Abraham. Abraham's a significant figure in Judaism and Christianity and Islam. And this, by the way, this is a ziggurat in Ur, and you've got some US troops climbing up it during the Gulf War. And so this is the remains of a ziggurat, which is like a step pyramid that was from Ur of the Chaldees. And they've discovered a lot of other materials there that they found in tombs, a royal tomb there and a library. And if you go to the British Museum, there's a lot of material that they've taken from Ur of the Chaldees. And they said, well, if Ur did exist, maybe Abraham existed. Nabonidus cylinder, we talked about this at the Prophetica program a week ago, where it names Belshazzar as the last king of Babylon. They didn't believe that he was the last king of Babylon. This is the Tel Dan stele. This is interesting because this was the first time a piece of archaeology had been found with the House of David written on it. Prior to that, in fact, 1 year before, in 1992, a skeptical archaeologist said that there is no evidence for the figure of David. He is a mythical character. He's probably made up by the biblical writers. A year later, they find the Tel Dan stele. I've been to Tel Dan. It's up in the north of the country. I've been to the place where they found this. And since then, they've found David on other archaeological remains too. Caesarea, it's on the coast of Israel. They found this slab of stone with Pontius Pilate's name on it. Pontius Pilate, you may know, was the governor in Judea when Jesus was crucified 2,000 years ago. And there are many, many others. We don't have time tonight to go into all the archaeological evidence. In the Old Testament, there's more than 53 people now that they've verified in the archaeological record that are in the Bible. That's the Old Testament. Doesn't count the New. There's a video that I would recommend to you. This used to be on Netflix as well. It's called Exodus Patterns of Evidence. And it's archaeological evidence for the Exodus and the captivity in Egypt. You know, when you remember the Ten Commandments and Moses crossing the Red Sea and all of that. Archaeological evidence for those things. So there's a lot of archaeological evidence in support of the historicity of the Bible. What about manuscript evidence? People say, how can you believe that this book is actually what we have? You know, that what they had is what we have. And somebody has suggested Chinese whispers, you know, is a reasonable comparison, but it actually doesn't work like that. In fact, even before the Bible was written, there was such a thing as oral tradition. What does that mean? It means that the community would keep the story alive within the community. So if I say to you, Mary had a little... How do you know that? We haven't talked about this. How did you know that that's the word? That's the word, right? Because we have a common culture. And if you know that if I said Mary had a little goat, you'd say, no, that's not right. It's Mary had a little lamb, right? Twinkle, twinkle, little... How did you know that? It's because we have a common culture and we know the story, right? So if I start singing Happy Birth Month to you, Happy Birth Month. No, it doesn't go like that. It's Happy Birthday, right? We all know that because we share a common culture. And back in Bible times, they shared a common culture. And they knew the stories. So that if somebody was saying something that was not quite right, saying, hey, hang on, that's not right. But then they wrote it down and they preserved it. Now, I should tell you, the Bible is written in two halves, really, the Old Testament and the New Testament. Quite simply, the Old Testament is 3/4 of your Bible. 3/4 of the Bible is written before Jesus came, and 1/4 of the Bible, the New Testament, is written after Jesus came. But did you know that until the 20th century, the oldest copies that we had of the Old Testament, the oldest pieces of paper, were from 900 AD. That meant that there's a 1,300-year gap between the piece of paper you're holding and when it was last written down. How could we possibly trust that that piece of paper still carried the same message that we have in the Bible today? Well, back in 1947, Muhammad al-Dahib was a goat herder and he discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls. In fact, he was chasing his goat who had gone into a cave and he was throwing stones to get his goat out, and he heard the sound of shattering pottery. And they found some of these jars, and in the jars were scrolls, and in the scrolls, they were the Dead Sea Scrolls. This is the National Geographic magazine that's out in the shops right now. The Dead Sea Scrolls, 75 years since their historic discovery. And these scrolls contained all of the Old Testament books except Esther, biblical commentaries of Old Testament books and psalms and hymns, and sectarian material belonging to the Qumran community itself. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, there is no mention of Jesus, Paul, or John. It's important to mention that because people say, oh, the Dead Sea Scrolls, they tell a different story about Jesus. It's not about Jesus. These are written 100 to 200 years BC. What does BC mean? Before Christ. Okay? And now they've excavated where that community lived. And these are some of the rooms there. They would take ritual baths before they would write out. So, a letter, a piece of paper deteriorates over time, especially if you handle it, right? And so as they would get worn out, they would rewrite them. But they would take a bath before they wrote, and they would say a prayer, and then they would write. And if they made a mistake, they'd tear it up, and they'd go back and have another bath, put on clean clothes, and start again. You wouldn't want to make too many mistakes. And this is one of those ritual baths they used to step into to wash before they copied out the scripture. Why? Because they did not think they were just writing out the shopping list. They did not think they were just writing a novel. They believed they were copying out the Word of God. And so they were meticulous in the way they copied. This is the scribe's room. This is where they believe many of the copies were made. What we have today is called the Masoretic text. That's the text that we had prior to discovering the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Masoretes had copying rules. Each letter must be counted. So you count the letters on a page to make sure the number of letters on this page was same as the number that you're copying from. Each word must be counted. They would count to the middle letter of the page, and they would count to the middle word of the page to check on both documents to make sure they were exactly the same document. Dr. Gleason Archer, who worked on the manuscripts of the Dead Sea Scrolls, he said 2 copies of Isaiah found in the caves proved to be word for word identical with our standard Hebrew Bible in more than 95% of the text. The 5% variation consisted chiefly of obvious slips of the pen and variations in spelling. So, for instance, if your name is Graham, you know there's 2 ways to spell Graham, but is it still Graham? You see what I'm saying? The Isaiah scroll from Cave 1, Dr. Sigrid Horn, he said its text proves that since this copy was written probably in the 2nd century BC or in the 1st, the book of Isaiah has not experienced any change. Everyone who has worked with this scroll has been profoundly impressed by the unmistakable fact that this 2,000-year-old Bible manuscript contains exactly the same text we possess today. And they're kept in the shrine of the book. They're Israel's most treasured possession there in Jerusalem. What about the New Testament? We talked about the Old Testament there. What about the New Testament? Well, the New Testament is the best attested to ancient document in existence. There are over 24,000 ancient manuscripts in Greek and other languages, which means they can be compared. Let me put that into some perspective. If you look at the works of Julius Caesar, written around 100 to 44 BC, you know he was assassinated in 44 BC. Written around 100 to 44 BC, the earliest manuscript we have, 900 AD. That's a 1,000-year time span between what was written and what we have. And we have 10 manuscript copies. The works of Plato, written 427 to 347 BC, the oldest manuscript we have is 900 AD. That's a 1,200-year time span difference between what we have and what he wrote. Yet nobody says we don't have the works of Plato. 7 manuscript copies. Tacitus, a Roman historian, wrote about 100 AD. We have earliest manuscript 1100 AD, a 1,000-year time span, 8 manuscripts of Tacitus. Homer's Iliad, 643 manuscript copies. Wow, that's a lot. But there's a 500-year time span between what we have and what was written. The New Testament, written between 40 and 100 AD. The earliest manuscript fragment we have is 125 AD. It's in the John Rylands Museum in Manchester. That's a 25 to 50-year time span, and we have 24,000 ancient manuscripts. There is a discipline called textual criticism. It's the discipline of making sure that we get back to what did they actually write? Because somebody will say, well, don't some manuscripts have some words added? Yes. Isn't that shocking? Not really. How do we know they were added? Because we have an earlier manuscript. See what I'm saying? It's not that we're arguing those words weren't added. No, it's called textual criticism. We piece together what they actually wrote. And we're very confident about the New Testament. What they actually wrote is what we have. Eyewitnesses to what took place in the first century. This is a very poor picture, by the way, of the fragment of John's Gospel in the John Rylands Museum dated to around 125 AD. This fragment alone is valued at £11 million. But I don't need the fragment because I have the whole book. But by the way, that is a poor picture because the fragment is about that big. It's between two panes of glass. It's in a cabinet that is controlled. The humidity and the temperature and everything is... You're not allowed to take pictures, otherwise I would have. And the fragment of papyrus, honestly, it looks like somebody's taken a brown texter. It's much clearer than that picture. That's a very poor picture of it. But it's quite interesting. These are some 2nd and 3rd century papyri, the Chester Beatty papyri. Some of these are in Chicago, some in Dublin. Sir Frederick Kenyon, he said this about the manuscript evidence. He said, "The Christian can take the whole Bible in his hand and say without fear or hesitation that he holds in his hand the Word of God, handed down without essential loss from generation to generation throughout the centuries." If you want more on this subject, there are a couple of books, The Canon of Scripture by F.F. Bruce and The New Testament Documents, Are They Reliable? If you want to read more about the manuscripts, you can certainly do that. You know what's fascinating? The Bible itself within it, this is written 700 years BC. It says, "The grass withers, the flower fades, but the word of our God stands forever." Don't you think it's amazing that we actually have this 3,500-year-old book? We still actually have access to it. That's amazing. Not least because there have been many attempts to destroy the Bible. You can read in Jeremiah, where Jeremiah is given a message. He writes out this long scroll, gives it to the king. The king throws it in the fire. And Jeremiah goes back and writes another one. Notice here Psalm 12, 6 and 7. "The words of the Lord are pure words, like silver tried in a furnace of earth, purified 7 times. You shall keep them, O Lord. You shall preserve them from this generation forever." That's written 3,000 years ago. And either it's a coincidence that we can still read it today, or somebody's been taking care of it. We're going to move on from archaeological evidence, internal consistency evidence, manuscript evidence, to prophetic evidence. It's been estimated that the Bible is about 30% predictive prophecy. That's a lot. It's a big book. 30% predictive prophecy. Now, that's really simple. Either the prophecies came to pass or they didn't. There are still some that have yet to be fulfilled. They're yet future. But most of the prophecies in the Bible have been fulfilled already. So we can go back into the history books and find out. By the way, if you compare this with other sacred writings, I mentioned before that the inspiration of the Bible is a claim that the Bible makes. The Bible claims that this was inspired of God. Many times in the Old Testament, the prophet will say, "Thus saith the prophet." No, "Thus saith the Lord." In other words, he's claiming this message comes from God. Now, there are very few books in the world that claim to be divinely inspired. The Bible's one of them. The Quran is another. But if you found internal consistency in the Quran, that would not be that surprising, as it's the product of one individual, Muhammad, right, who claimed to get his messages from Gabriel. Only one person put that together. So my point is, when you read the Quran, when you read the writings of the Hindus, I've worked in India a couple of times. When you look at Buddhist writing, no predictive prophecy. Why not? Because in order to predict the future, you'd have to know the future. And the God of this book claims to know the future. So let's check that out. In Isaiah 46, written 700 years BC, Isaiah 46, 9 and 10, God is speaking. He says, "Remember the former things of old, for I am God and there is no other. I am God and there's none like me, declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times things that are not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand and I will do all my pleasure." And there are lots of prophecies in the Bible. As I mentioned, many of them have already been fulfilled. Prophecies about kingdoms like Egypt, Babylon, Tyre. It would be like today making a prophecy about the United States, because these powers were heavyweights in their day, right? The major world powers of their time, but prophecies were given about what would happen to them. I've had the privilege of going to Egypt several times. I really enjoy going there, and there are prophecies in the Bible about Egypt, even when it was at its height. In Ezekiel 30:13, it says, "Thus says the Lord God, I will also destroy the idols and cause the images to cease from Noph." That's a word in the Bible that means Memphis. Egypt had a northern capital and a southern capital. The northern capital was Memphis, the southern capital was Thebes. If you go to the area where the northern capital was, Memphis, there's hardly anything there today. It is quite amazing. Amelia Edwards is an Egyptologist. Not necessarily the most ardent reader of the Bible, but she says when she went to visit Memphis, she says, "Where are the stately ruins, which even in the Middle Ages extended over the space of half a day's journey in each direction? One can hardly believe that a great city flourished on this spot, or understand how it should have been effaced so completely." Ezekiel also writes, he says, "There shall no longer be princes from the land of Egypt. I will put fear in the land of Egypt." Now, princes, that's heirs from the Egyptian people. You know, the people who live in Egypt today are not the Egyptians. You get that, right? I hope you understand that people who live in Egypt today are the Arabs. That's why they speak Arabic. Right? The people of the Egyptian era, they're not, you can't find them. They don't exist anymore. There shall be no longer princes from the land of Egypt. You think about their mighty monuments. You know, when Egypt was a major power at the time of Ezekiel, and then a power came after. Ezekiel got carried off to Babylon, but a power came after Babylon, which was the Medes and the Persians, and they went down into Egypt. Then Alexander came, and he went down into Egypt, declared himself the Pharaoh. He was buried, they say he was buried in a golden coffin, Alexander the Great. Then after the Greeks, of course, the Romans. Ever heard of Cleopatra? Cleopatra was the last queen of Egypt, but she wasn't really an Egyptian, she was a Greek. She was a Greek Egyptian queen. And of course, Julius Caesar had a relationship with Cleopatra, then Julius died, then Mark Antony had a relationship with Cleopatra, and Cleopatra and Mark Antony finally died, and then the Romans took over Egypt. And the Romans ruled in Egypt for many years, and then when the Romans disappeared from there, the Arabs took over. The Muslims from Saudi Arabia, they came, and the Arabs are all across North Africa today. And no native princes from Egypt. You know what's interesting to me? The word Egypt is kind of a manufactured word. It's not the word that the Egyptians called themselves. In the biblical text, in the book of Genesis, Egypt is described as Mitzrayim. He was a grandson of Noah, according to Genesis. But you go to Egypt today, and Misra is what they call Egypt in Egypt. They still use the same word that the Bible uses in the book of Genesis. You've got the Bank of Misra, and Misra Pharmacies, and Misra Petrol Station, Misra University, Misra Online, Misra Airlines. That's the name they use for Egypt. Let's move on from Egypt to ancient Babylon. There are prophecies there too. This is the Ishtar Gate. You'll find this in the Berlin Museum. You may have heard of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, one of the 7 wonders of the world, of the ancient world. Notice what Isaiah wrote, 700 BC. This is before Babylon got to its peak. It says, "In Babylon, the glory of kingdoms, the beauty of the Chaldeans' prize will be as when God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah. It will never be inhabited, nor will it be settled from generation to generation, nor will the Arabian pitch tents there, nor will the shepherds make their sheepfolds there." You go to the ruins of Babylon. What's interesting is, you ever heard of Saddam Hussein? Saddam Hussein revered one of the kings of Babylon called Nebuchadnezzar. And Saddam Hussein decided he was going to start to rebuild Babylon. And so you've got Nebuchadnezzar's bricks over here and Saddam Hussein's bricks over there. But he never finished his project because the first Gulf War broke out. And by the time we get to the second Gulf War, well, the Americans were determined to get him, and eventually some of his own people got him and they hung him for crimes against the country. And Babylon's still in ruins. What about Tyre? Where's Tyre, you might ask? If you've ever been to Lebanon, it's just north of Israel today, on the coast. Tyre used to have a mainland city and also an island offshore, about 800 metres offshore. There is a prophecy, which is incredible to me, in Ezekiel 26 about Tyre. It says, "Therefore, thus says the Lord God, behold, I am against you, O Tyre." Now, why is God, by the way, why is God against all these civilizations? Doesn't seem very nice. But all these civilizations were incredibly cruel. They were not just. And justice prevailed in the end. But he says, "But I am against you, O Tyre, and will cause many nations," how many? Many nations to come against you, as the sea causes its waves to come up. "And they shall destroy the walls of Tyre, and break down her towers, and I will scrape her dust from her, and make her like the top of a rock. It shall be a place for spreading nets in the midst of the sea. For I have spoken, says the Lord God, it shall become plunder for the nations." It says it's going to become a place for spreading nets in the midst of the sea. Now you cast a net in the midst of the sea. You don't spread a net in the sea. You spread the net on the land to dry them. So what happened to Tyre? Well, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon eventually came to the city of Tyre, and he laid siege to it for 13 years. They must have had a lot of food store in there and whatever. 13 years. I mean, if the trucks stop rolling to Coles and Woolies, how long will we last? What do you reckon? 13 weeks? 13 years he laid siege to Tyre, tried and starve them out, but the people managed to escape, and they got in boats and sailed over to the island. And Nebuchadnezzar was on foot with his chariots. He didn't have any boats, so he couldn't reach the island. So he decides to destroy the city, but the people survived on the island of Tyre. 200 years later, Alexander the Great comes down to Tyre. And again, the people had repopulated the city of Tyre, and when Alexander came, they decided to flee to the island once more. And Alexander the Great was a determined man. He didn't have any boats with him, but he decided that he would start to build a causeway. And he took the timber and the pillars and the stones and the dust from the city of Tyre, and he dumped them all in the sea. He had his men build a causeway 700 to 800 metres long. Can you imagine being on the island? As metre by metre, Alexander is laying all of this debris in the water to build a causeway to get to the island. He gave them a chance. He says, you surrender, you'll live. No, we're not surrendering. We're here on our safe island. Okay. And he built the causeway. Notice what it says in the text. They will plunder your riches and pillage your merchandise. They will break down your walls and destroy your pleasant houses. They will lay your stones, your timber, and your soil in the midst of the water. I will make you like the top of a rock. You shall be a place for spreading nets, and you shall never be rebuilt, for I, the Lord, have spoken. If you look at the coast of Lebanon today, the island has become a peninsula. It's silted up, the causeway that went from the mainland to the island. And today, the fishermen spread their nets on the causeway. There are many other prophecies, and we will cover some of them in this series, so please keep coming back. You know, I mentioned before about being a bestseller. This is Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code. Anybody read that? I read that book. And Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code was the #1 New York Times bestseller for 2003 and 2004. And it was #2 in 2005. So more than 80 million copies worldwide. There were very few books in the world at that time that outsold Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code. But the Bible is one of them. Why would that still be outselling a book that makes claims about the contents of the Bible? Well, largely because Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code, of course, was found in the fiction section of the bookstore, even though he said, you know, everything's legit in here. But that was fiction too. That's part of the story. But the Bible outsold that book because the Bible is a tried and tested book. It's been around for a while. People have seen its influence on their own lives. Mahatma Gandhi was a Hindu. And he said this. He said, you Christians have in your keeping a document with enough dynamite in it to blow the whole of civilization to bits, to turn society upside down, to bring peace to this war-torn world. But you read it as if it were just good literature and nothing else. That's interesting. And perhaps the best description of the Bible is within its own pages. In Psalm 119, 105, it says, your word is a lamp to my feet and a light to my path. When you're walking down a dark alley, isn't it nice to have a flashlight in your hand? That's what it is to us. The Bible is a light to our path. It helps us to see where we're going. That's the point of it. And, you know, the Bible offers you assurance, identity, confidence, forgiveness, hope, security, direction, knowledge of the future, freedom, contentment, self-worth, optimism, peace of mind, a blueprint for life, and a whole lot more. And my own testimony of having been raised never reading the Bible to now having read the Bible several times is that it is the Word of God to my life. It's the Word of God to my soul. My life has benefited in immeasurable ways because of the teachings of that book. That's my own personal story. You know, I mentioned in last program that in the 1960s, Time magazine put out a cover called Is God Dead? And in 2017, they deliberately published a similar headline in the same design. And it said, Is truth dead? And I think it's very interesting that Time magazine essentially choose to equate God and truth. Is God dead? Well, then truth's dead. But if God's not dead, then neither's truth. If you ever go to the United States and go to Langley, Virginia, you'll find the headquarters of the CIA. And if you go into the building of the headquarters of the CIA, chiseled onto the wall is a Bible verse. And it's this. It's from John 8:32. It says, "And you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." I have never felt freer than I do now, having understood some of the messages of this book. And what we're going to do in this series is we're going to explore evidence for the existence of God, evidence for the reliability of the Bible. We're going to explore some of its claims. We're going to explore some of its prophecies. Not only the ones that have already been fulfilled, although they're amazing, but also the ones that are just yet to be fulfilled. Nothing could be more important. I believe you have a card. Can I have a card, Bridget? Can I have that card? Thanks. Does everybody have one of these? I'd like you to respond to what you've heard in this second session. On the back of the card, you will see 4 boxes, 1, 2, 3, 4. And I just want you to respond in there to what we have on the screen here. Number 1, I would like to know more about these important subjects. If this has whetted your appetite and you would like to know more, please tick that box. We'll make sure that you get some resources. So just put yes or tick in box number 1 if you would like to know more about these important subjects. Number 2, I would like a free copy of the Bible. Maybe you don't have a Bible. Like I said, if you get your smartphone out, you can find thousands of them for free. However, if you'd like a physical copy of the Bible and you don't have one, tick that box. We'll make sure you get one, okay? We want to make sure that you get one. I would like a free copy of the Bible. Number 3, I would like a copy of today's notes. Would you like the notes from today's sessions 1 and 2? If you want those session notes, just tick box number 3. And number 4, email or hard copy. You will notice on the top of the card there's a space there. If you want to put your email address there and you want us to email you the notes, we can do that. If you would like a hard copy printed out for you, just put H in box 4. And we will print a copy of the notes for you and you can collect them when you come to the program next time, okay? Fill out your name. If you want to put a contact phone number on there, you can do that. Please fill out the card, hand them in, and we'll make sure that you get the resources that you have asked for. We're about to wrap up. It's high time we moved on. But tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, right here, we're going to be talking about, did we really evolve? Can I have the brochure, Bridget? Did we really evolve? And I want to talk tomorrow about what I do believe about evolution and what I don't believe about evolution. I grew up in the UK. I was an atheist. I went to secular school, got taught evolution. That's the way I thought we all arrived here. But tomorrow I'm going to talk about what I do believe about evolution and what I don't believe about evolution. So come tomorrow. Did we really evolve? 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. At 11 o'clock tomorrow morning, we're going to probably cover the most frequently asked question by atheists, agnostics, and believers. And that is, if there's a God of love, why so much suffering? We're going to ask that question and we're going to seek to explore that tomorrow at 11. So come tomorrow at 10, did we really evolve? Tomorrow at 11, why so much suffering? Take a brochure with you, take one for your friends, invite them to come tomorrow. Drop your card into the box. I think Eamon's got the box out there on the table. Just drop your card in there and we look forward to seeing you hopefully tomorrow at 10. Thank you for being a great audience and I'll see you tomorrow.